I want to begin by thanking Danny Dayan and Ron Projer and all the other people who were responsible for canceling the original event in Tel Aviv, for bringing so many of you to Potsdam and 500 of you online. What censors everywhere never grasp, censoring material only makes it more exciting. When he forbade Adam and Eve to eat the apple, God made a massive mistake. Had he not bothered to draw their attention to it, they would have passed right by the tree. Now, tonight's discussion is in English, but I want to begin with 10 minutes or so of Deutsch, and I hope those of you who don't speak German will forgive me. But 22 years of experience in this job has shown that German media tends to report more and more accurately when a talk is in German. This is also the case with uncontroversial subjects. We notice at the Einstein Forum that when we have a mixed language conference, it's the German language talks which are usually reported. And though I've been misquoted even in German, I thought I would give it a try in German, because this is not an uncontroversial event. Those of you who are watching online will have a chance to ask some questions after the event itself will be slightly longer than an hour. We like to have discussion at the Einstein Forum, hope and trust and expect that there will be lots of it tonight. We will try to respond to those of you who write in online. Please do not use the chat function, use the Q&A or F&A function on your screen. Also, was macht schon wieder das Einstein-Forum? Nun glauben wir fest an die Meinungsfreiheit und sind bereit dafür aufzustehen, wie unser Namensgeber sein Leben lang es tat. Natürlich gibt es Menschen, die wir nicht einladen würden. Niemand, der zur Gewalt aufruft, und sei es auch verbaler Natur, wäre hier willkommen. Aber hat Charlotte Wiedemann oder Bashir Bashir oder Amos Goldberg zur Gewalt aufgerufen? Ganz im Gegenteil. Was die Arbeit aller drei verbindet, ist der Aufruf zur Empathie. Charlottes Buchtitel besteht aus so einem Aufruf, den Schmerz der anderen begreifen. Und man muss nur die erste Seite des Buches lesen, das Amos und Bashir zusammen herausgegeben haben, um sofort zu sehen, es geht nicht um Gleichsetzung der Holocaust und der Nakba, wie vorgeworfen wurde. Ausgerechnet Edward Said wird in diesem Buch zitiert mit dem Satz: Who would morally want to equate mass murder with mass dispossession? Da muss man allerdings ein bisschen weiter im Buch lesen, nicht erste Seite. Worum es Bashir und Goldberg geht, haben sie in einem früheren Aufsatz Disruptive Empathy genannt. Nämlich ohne zu verstehen, wie die beiden historischen Ereignisse einander bedingt haben, wird es weder Frieden noch Gerechtigkeit ins gelobte Land geben. Solches Verständnis, schreiben sie, gab es auch kurz nach der Gründung des Staates Israel unter jüdischen Israelis. Aber in einer Zeit, wo die bloße Aneinanderreihung beider Worte, Holocaust und Nakba, zu einem Skandälchen führt, ist solches Verständnis verschwunden. Die Folgen haben Bashir und Goldberg zusammengefasst. Ich zitiere aus ihrem ausgezeichneten Buch. Leider, Sie können Charlottes Buch draußen erwerben, wenn Sie möchten. Sie will auch signieren. Dieses schönes Buch könnten wir nicht, es ist auf Englisch, es ist auf Amazon erhältlich. Wir könnten es nicht hier vorrätig bekommen, aber ich kann es wärmstens empfehlen. Sie schreiben, auf Englisch wieder, both the Holocaust and the Nakba as dominant national narratives serve to bolster exclusive identities within the two groups. For the most part, each group sees its own catastrophe as a unique event and seeks to devalue or even deny the catastrophe of the other. Es war die Suche nach Empathie für die andere, die Bashir und Goldberg zu der Arbeit an dieses Buch führte, in der Hoffnung, dass Empathie für die Katastrophen der anderen zu einem Durchbruch im Gewaltzyklus führen konnte. Also wie kam die heutige Veranstaltung zustande? Ich hatte Charlottes Buch im Spätsommer bekommen und fand es einen sehr hilfreichen Beitrag zu den Debatten, die seit 2 Jahren im Land toben. Und so habe ich sie für den 2. Februar eingeladen und nichts weiteres dabei gedacht. Bis ich plötzlich als Zeitungsleserin erstaunt war, dass eine neue Debatte in den deutschen Medien über eine geplante Veranstaltung in Tel Aviv ausbrach, gerade in dem Moment, wo der Staat Israel eine Regierungspartei bekommen hat, die auch von konservativen Juden faschistisch genannt wird. Zum Glück lese ich täglich auch amerikanische, britische und eine israelische Zeitung. So wusste ich einiges über die israelischen Parteien, die man in den deutschen Medien kaum mitbekommen konnte. Zum Beispiel der Tatsache, dass Itamar Ben-Gvir, jetzt Minister für internationale Sicherheit, hatte schon als junger Mann ein derartiger Hang zum Terrorismus gegen Palästinenser, dass es ihm nicht erlaubt war, in der Armee zu dienen. Soweit ich weiß, gibt es keinen vergleichbaren Fall. Und Ben-Gvir ist nicht mit dem Alter milder geworden, im Gegenteil. Er rief zur Ermordung von Israels Premierminister Yitzhak Rabin auf und wirbt für die Freilassung seines Attentäters. Zu dem Zeitpunkt, wo die deutschen Medien mehrmals täglich von einem Skandalveranstaltung geschrieben haben, war diese Auskunft über die neue israelische Regierung nicht in deutschen Quellen zu lesen. Allmählich hat es auch in der deutschen Presse durchgesickert, hauptsächlich dank Israelis wie Avrum Burg, Omri Böhm oder Tom Segev, die keine Angst haben, antisemitisch genannt zu werden, wenn sie die Dinge beim Namen nennen. Und als die Empörung über die Veranstaltung nicht verschwand und die Verantwortlichen sich reuevoll entschuldigte, haben wir im Einstein-Forum entschieden, zusammen mit Charlotte Wiedemann einfach Bashir und Amos einzuladen, auch dank einer großzügigen Spende von Michael Wild. Ich muss natürlich nicht mit allen Gedanken denjenigen einverstanden sein, die ich im Einstein-Forum einlade. Das wäre ziemlich langweilig und würde nichts zur Debattenkultur beitragen. Ich schätze, dass ich auch hier nicht mit allen einverstanden sein werde. Charlotte nennt sich manchmal Postkolonialist. Ich dagegen bin amüsiert, wenn ich zu den Postkolonialisten gezählt wurde, denn ich habe mit der postkolonialen Theorie nichts, aber gar nichts am Hut. Was natürlich nicht heißt, dass ich Kolonialismus gutheiße. Derzeit in Deutschland scheint nur 1 von 2 Haltungen möglich. Entweder man ist auf der Seite der Juden oder auf der Seite der Postkolonialisten. Da es kein deutsches Wort für People of Color gibt, ist Postkolonialist auch zur Formel geworden, um People of Color zu nennen. Dass es viele Juden gibt, die auch auf die Seite von People of Color stehen und nicht jüdische Deutsche, die Empathie für beide haben, scheint hier unverständlich. Die Anstrengungen dieser 3 Autoren brauchen aber keine postkoloniale Theorie. Ich dachte, es würde Charlotte überraschen, aber ich habe es ihr vorher erzählt. Ich verstehe ihr Projekt in einem kantischen Sinne. Denn sie schreibt, dass Empathie kein Gefühl ist, sondern eine intellektuelle Tat. Und nach Kant gibt es 3 Grundregeln für gutes Denken. Selbstdenken, Nummer 1. Sich in der Mitteilung mit Menschen in die Stelle jedes anderen zu denken. Und 3. jederzeit mit sich selbst einstimmig zu denken. Ende Zitat Immanuel Kant. Ich weiß, die meisten hier haben mal gehört, Kant sei ein böser Rassist gewesen, wissen nicht, dass er die stärksten Angriffe auf den Kolonialismus geschrieben hat. Aber das ist ein Thema im Einstein-Forum für nächstes Jahr. Für heute reicht es einfach zu sagen, dass alle 3 unserer Autoren nach Kants Grundregeln schreiben und am deutlichsten nach den 2. sich in die Stelle jedes anderen zu denken. Soll das wirklich eine Affront sein? Es gibt mehrere Gründe für die Hysterie, die seit 2 Jahren hierzulande bei den Themen Juden, Israel, Palästina und Erinnerung herrscht. Ich werde sie natürlich nicht alle aufzählen. Es ist kein Geheimnis. Deutsche tun sich schwer auf die eine oder der andere Weise mit der Vergangenheit. Manchmal möchte ich für Nachsicht plädieren. Keine andere Nation hat jemals versucht, ein Verbrechen ins Zentrum ihrer nationalen Narrative zu stellen. Andere Länder wollen Heldennarrativen und wenn es nicht anders geht, Opfernarrativen. Nur die Deutschen haben ihre Täterschaft als Massenmörder in den Mittelpunkt gesetzt. Wenn kein anderes Land es je gemacht hat, verdienen die Deutschen auch ein bisschen Nachsicht. Wie sollen sie als Erste alles richtig machen? Aber eins, was immer problematischer wird, stammt auch aus dieser Anerkennung der Täterschaft. Wenn Deutsche das Tätervolk seien, seien die Juden das Opfervolk. Ich lehne beide Begriffe ab. Wie die große Bürgerrechtler Brian Stevenson sagte, kann niemand auf seine schlimmste Tat reduziert werden. Wenn das für Einzelpersonen stimmt, umso mehr für Nationen. Gleiches gilt für Opfer. Es gibt wohl keinen Mensch, der nur als Opfer dasteht und niemand möchte darauf reduziert sein. Dass die Juden in dem Holocaust eine Hölle erlitten haben, die davor unvorstellbar war, kann nicht bestritten werden, sicherlich nicht von einer Jüdin. Aber ich habe immer den Versuch einer Hierarchisierung des Leids zu unternehmen, entschieden abgelehnt, und zwar nicht nur bei Juden. Neulich gibt es eine Gedenkrichtung in den USA, die sich Afropessimismus nennt. Danach haben schwarze Menschen härter, intensiver und länger gelitten als alle anderen Menschen in die Geschichte. Das ist hier noch ziemlich unbekannt, aber genauso problematisch wie das Beharren darauf, dass die Juden nun die schlimmsten Verfolgungen aller Zeiten erlebt haben. Wonach will man messen? Und vor allem, was bringen solche Behauptungen? Sollen wir nicht lieber die disruptive empathy von Amos und Bashir praktizieren oder, wie Charlotte es nennt, den Schmerz der anderen begreifen? Wenn wir es nicht aus Prinzipien tun, wie wäre es mit Pragmatismus? Wie können wir erwarten, dass andere Menschen sich dem Kampf gegen Antisemitismus anschließen, wenn wir nicht bereit sind, genauso stark gegen Rassismus aufzustehen? Auf solche universalistischen Vorschläge lese ich öfters, letzte Woche in die Zeit zum Beispiel, dass ich nicht in der Lage sein kann, den Schmerz und die Angst der deutschen Juden zu verstehen, weil ich Ami bin. Was in Deutschland oft vergessen wird, nicht alle amerikanischen Juden leben in New York. Im tiefen Süden, wo ich aufgewachsen bin, wurde die Synagoge von den Ku Klux Klan gebombt, als ich Kleinkind war. Es geschah früh morgens, so wurde kein Mensch getroffen, aber der Tat hat Angst und Schrecken in der jüdischen Gemeinde eingejagt. Und so war es gemeint. Denn es gab 2 andere Synagogen in Atlanta, Georgia, und die würden verschont. Unsere Synagoge war getroffen, weil der Rabbiner Mitstreiter von Martin Luther King war, zu einer Zeit, wo King kein Heiliger, sondern ein Aufständischer war. Ja, das passierte oft. Viele Deutsche haben erst von multidirektionaler Erinnerung erfahren, als Michael Rothbergs Buch in Deutsch übersetzt wurde. In der Tat gab es sie schon sehr lange. Dass Joe Biden überhaupt regieren kann, liegt daran, dass ein Schwarzer und ein Jude aus Georgia zusammen gekämpft haben, erinnernd an diese Solidarität und somit den Senat für die Demokraten gewonnen haben. Einer, der diese Solidarität lebte, war Albert Einstein. Ich weiß, auch ich habe einmal geglaubt, Einstein sei nichts anderes als ein weltfremdes Genie. Tatsächlich habe ich gelernt, er war eine geschickte öffentliche Intellektuell ohnegleichen. Kaum den Nazis entronnen, hat er sich in der amerikanischen Bürgerrechtsbewegung engagiert, und das gegen die explizite Warnung des Rektors des Institute of Advanced Studies, der schrieb, dass er Einsteins Sicherheit nur garantieren konnte, wenn er den Mund hält. Einstein hat nie den Mund gehalten, trotz sogar Todesdrohungen, die ihn ab Mitte der 20er Jahre begleiteten. Aber er hat auch nicht auf seine Emigration gewartet, um sich für den Schmerz der anderen einzusetzen. Schon 1929 hat er seinen Freund Chaim Weizmann, der später der erste Präsident Israels, gewarnt, ich zitiere, sollen wir nicht in der Lage sein, ehrliche Kooperation mit den Arabern zu vereinbaren, dann haben wir nichts aus unserer 2000-jährige Leitgeschichte gelernt und verdienen das Schicksal, das uns befallen wird. Ende Zitat, Albert Einstein. Ich kann es nicht helfen, das ist ein bekanntes Zitat, egal wie schwer es im heutigen Deutschland passt. So wie ich es nicht helfen kann, dass Einstein mehrmals das Wort faschistisch benutzt hat für den Massaker an arabischen Bürgern in Deir Yassin, für das der spätere Stadtchef Menachem Begin verantwortlich war. Was jetzt meist vergessen wurde, heute trauen liberalen Israelis Begin nach, weil er im Vergleich zu Netanyahu, geschweige seiner Regierungspartnern, als Demokrat und Verteidiger der Rechte der Araber erscheint. Dennoch hat Einsteins Kritik den ersten Staatschefs Israels, David Ben-Gurion, nicht davon abgehalten, ihm die Präsidentschaft Israels anzubieten. Privat fragte Ben-Gurion allerdings, was machen wir nur, wenn er zusagt? Es gibt also kein besseres Ort als das Einstein-Forum, die heutige Veranstaltungen zu halten. Ich freue mich sehr auf unsere Diskussion.
I'm delighted and grateful to be here. And I thank Susan very much for the generous invitation to have the event here. I also thank Amos and Bashir very much for coming all the way just to be here tonight. That's extremely kind of you. And this is actually the first time the three of us are sitting in one room, because after what happened in Tel Aviv, I just had a cup of tea, so with Bashir. But I know Amos only from his comforting voice when I was in shock about, on the phone, his comforting voice on the phone, when I was in shock about what happened to me. Okay, so also for the camera, this is my book. I'm going to talk for the next 25 to 30 minutes about my book. And I had finished my book when I came across Amos and Bashir's book. But I somehow instantly understood, just when I looked into a few of the compiled essays, that there is a lot of connection between your approach and my approach. And so, again, I'm very glad to be finally here with you. And I also have to say that when I looked into the book again this morning, considering the fact that this book had, within 4 years, hardly any echo in Germany, but it will appear, as Bashir told us, soon in Japanese and in, what was it? In? Italian. I was feeling kind of sudden pain, how much our debate is often disconnected from important intellectual inspirations from elsewhere. Okay, just launching into it. There's a strong desire in all European societies with a colonial past to minimize former atrocities and maintain at least a modicum of the cozy belief in a civilizing mission. Germany is neither better nor worse in this respect. But only here could this attitude take on a particular shape, a moralistic costume. So calling for more attention to colonial crimes can easily be condemned as endangering the commemoration of the Holocaust. And worse still, exploring links between both periods of European violence borders on anti-Semitism. Of course, not everybody is of this opinion. The majority, in my estimation, is not. But a few influential figures, groups, and media outlets have spoiled public discourse to the extent that discussing memory culture is seen by many as dangerous, almost a minefield. Actually, I forgot to say in the beginning that I'm delivering now exactly the same keynote I intended to give in Tel Aviv. I was thinking for a moment if I should alter it for the audience here, but then I decided no, for the sake of transparency, and I think this is now here also quite a kind of a documentary we are turning together. Okay, so almost a minefield. My book maps a different path. I make a radical departure from the binaries and hostilities of this so-called cultural war, and I reintroduce the ethical questions at the core of the debate. Because discussing memory is not just speaking about the past. Conceiving of a just or inclusive memory is closely linked to urgent questions about the present and the future. And the very moment our consciousness includes the colonial experience of a vast part of the world, we make a surprising discovery how difficult it is to imagine human beings as truly equal. I come back to this point in a moment. Let me first give you some idea of my own background and motivation. I was born 9 years after Auschwitz was liberated. As a teenager, I realized at some point that I lived in uncomfortable proximity to the perpetrator generation. I grew up with the obdurate silence of my parents, including about my father's Nazi Party membership. Quite early, I started feeling the abyss beneath my feet, that unspeakable dark space. Everything linked to Nazi atrocities became like a second skin. Throughout my life as a foreign reporter, this intensely felt Germanness of mine was combined with a multitude of experience in non-European countries. When I lived in Southeast Asia, I learned how different the Second World War was perceived by societies that lived under Japanese occupation. In West and North Africa, I learned how respectful the 1 million colonial soldiers are remembered who fought under the French flag for the liberation of Europe from Nazi rule. And they were not allowed to march down the Champs-Élysées on Victory Day, since victory had to look white. All this motivated what I call my search movements across the landscape of global memory, always in a dialogue between the two strands of my life, the Germanist side and the cosmopolitan, or, if you like, moderately post-colonial side. And this is also a dialogue between two major concerns. How can we preserve the memory of Nazi crimes with sensitivity and care? And how can we overcome white Eurocentric thinking about history and our place in the world? I share with Michael Rothberg, who is a friend, the idea that the memory of mass crimes is not competitive in the sense of a competition for limited memory space. But I go way beyond the notion of Holocaust versus colonialism. In Cambodia, I examined why a genocide in a poor country is not considered to have a universal message. In the Baltic states, I saw people walking their dogs on major killing sites of the Shoah, and I discovered with sadness how little Holocaust memory counts for the majority society, because Stalin's crimes are more conducive to fostering national feelings. And of course, now with Putin, this is adding up. Memory policies are about power. They decide about belonging to a society or not, and they can support or block imagining equality. For me, the Holocaust will always remain a tragedy of special significance. But this significance must never be used to devalue other sufferings. And globally speaking, people see the extermination of the Jews and also the state of Israel from varying perspectives, and rarely through the German lens. I always carried with me a suitcase full of open questions. It was never my intention to end up with an empty suitcase, but to refine my questions and sort out old, inappropriate answers. So I engage my readers in an intellectual adventure to conceive of what human equality might be. Apparently and tragically, Holocaust memory has not brought us much closer to this sense of equality. On the contrary, far too often it contributes to distressing hierarchies of victimhood. I address this as the political economy of empathy. And a better understanding of how empathy works is key to inclusive memory, as well as to a more just approach to human rights issues of the present. As we see from how refugees are routinely categorized in good and bad, in whether fleeing their homes was justified or not, empathy is steered by political assumptions. These assumptions make some of them appear similar to us and others dissimilar, alien, or even threatening. We should not confuse empathy with pure emotion. Empathy is first and foremost an intellectual act, to put yourself for a moment in the shoes of the other. Empathy as such cannot bridge structural injustice, but it can help to imagine a path to overcoming injustice. I think the three of us are getting to this point later. Crucial to this process is whether we see the other as a human being on an equal footing. And we frequently fail to do so, which is why memory culture suffers from racist mental blocks. In Germany, the neglected status of colonial victims is certainly the most telling example. To the present day, there is not a single dignified memorial site to remember the estimated 1 million African victims of German colonization. But how exactly does the economy of empathy work in the minds of those who consider themselves enlightened humanists? To illustrate, I compare the German perception of Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto and of East African resistance to German colonial rule 40 years earlier. During the Maji-Maji War in what is now Tanzania, approximately 200,000 Africans were either shot or left to starve. They had fought desperately for liberation from colonial oppression in a grimly asymmetrical warfare. So how come resistance in the Jewish ghetto has been met with so much respect, while African resistance is for most Germans of no interest at all, worthy of neither respect nor empathy? The answer is brutally simple. For contemporary Germans, identifying with Jewish victims has become a strong feature of philo-Semitic memory culture and is, of course, a way of dealing with feelings of guilt. In harsh contrast, no one in the majority society can imagine being a colonized black person. And whereas the image of Jews has changed substantially since the Nazi era, that of Africans has changed little since colonial times. So the fact that 200,000 died in a desperate struggle has no meaning and gains no admiration. To conclude, it is a disturbing outcome of Holocaust memory that only Jews seem to be on equal footing with white Germans. The contrast between colonial and Holocaust victims is merely the most striking example of divided empathy. A pattern of hierarchy is also applied to different groups of Nazi victims. Take Roma and Sinti. In Nazi genocidal ideology, they were closely linked to Jews, also a race to be annihilated. Today, however, their status in public remembrance is much closer to colonial victims. I call them victims who are not missed. Roma and Sinti are the most discriminated minority in Europe today. In order to create a just memory, we need to repair the psychological damage that racist policies inflicted on our consciousness and our ethical categories. And I see a connection between those unmissed victims from the past and certain victim groups in the present. Take the thousands who died as collateral damage following drone strikes in Afghanistan, Yemen, or the Sahel. In many cases, no one has even apologized to their families, as if they never existed. For me, one of the most important lessons of the Holocaust is that there is no such thing as a neglectable life. That's why I consider civil society efforts to rescue refugees from drowning in the Mediterranean Sea an excellent example of a new, well-conceived memory culture. So the question is not whether Holocaust memory should shrink to make space for more colonial or other remembrance. This is a willfully misleading interpretation. It's not about space, it's about the ethical and political essence we draw from mass crimes and genocides. And it's about the global imbalance of their recognition. At precisely the time of the Nuremberg trials, European nations were committing atrocities in their colonies for which the term crimes against humanity is equally fitting. In 1947, when the first edition of Anne Frank's diary was released in Amsterdam, the Dutch army annihilated the male population of entire villages in Indonesia to suppress the struggle for independence. Up until today, Indonesian widows, now in their late 90s, are fighting in Dutch courts to gain recognition for their suffering. And up until today, laws and institutions, international institutions that are considered an outcome of the Holocaust are still heavily stained with double standards. Although the limitations of such white universalism have been challenged for decades by intellectuals from the global south. Or look at the many connecting dots between National Socialism and colonialism. I came across one striking example of the language used by the Nazi Wehrmacht in Eastern Europe. They called the non-German auxiliary forces in extermination camps askari. The same word had been used 40 years earlier to describe the African auxiliary forces in Germany's colonial wars. Askari is the Arabic word for soldier. It entered colonial parlance through Swahili, and from there it passed into the language the Wehrmacht deployed at sites of the Shoah in Eastern Europe. The word even appears in SS General Stroop's infamous report on the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. It was a report for Heinrich Himmler. Do we need more to see connections? Colonialism is nothing other than the denial of equality. But the public conversation rarely penetrates to this simple and at the same time complicated core of the matter. For it takes a utopian force of imagination to picture what we have never been taught to imagine, a world not structured colonially. And what would a global memory landscape be like if all human suffering had the same right to narration and entered into a common heritage? In my view, the denial of equality is at the core of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I'm eager to learn from Bashir and Amos whether understanding the pain of others can have meaning in this context. And they are, of course, infinitely more qualified to talk about the entangled but entirely different historical events, the Holocaust and the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe. But since I'm the first speaker in row, I now will add a few basic facts about the Nakba, which were not included in the keynote for Tel Aviv because they were not necessary for an audience in Israel. Nakba is, in short, the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians from cities and villages in the course of establishing the State of Israel in 1948. The following confiscation of property and land, the demolition of about 500 villages, and up till now, the prohibition to return, even for those who are living in very close proximity to the village of their fathers and mothers. It is not possible to expel that number of people without violence. Several massacres triggered panic and mass flight. These are established historical facts since at least the 1980s, when Israeli historians were able to examine hitherto classified documents and write their books. Palestinian historians wrote about the Nakba much earlier, but were not taken seriously in the West. Which reminds me of the Jewish historians after the Shoah, who were considered to be too one-sided. For example, in the case of the Ukraine, their reports about the nationalist anti-Semite mass crimes were long overlooked. Back to the Nakba. I want to clarify one point often misunderstood in Germany. The expulsions were only to a lesser extent a consequence of the Arab-Israeli war, which means of the attack on the part of the neighboring Arab states in May 1948. Rather, it was a matter of strategically winning a clear and powerful Jewish majority in the future state. Such a majority did the United Nations partition plan not provide. The UN had assigned to the Jewish minority more than half of the Palestine territory. Within this state, 45% of the inhabitants would have been Arabs without the Nakba. I understand that against the backdrop of German history, there are psychological obstacles to realizing that serious crimes were committed in order to guarantee a state with a stable Jewish majority. It seems to be unthinkable and morally forbidden to discuss. Some claim that talking about the Nakba is already proof of anti-Semitism. Last May, the Berlin authorities banned all manifestations associated with the anniversary of the Nakba. In my eyes, a shameful and unconstitutional ban. Somehow, hearts and minds have hardened in order to deny the suffering of Palestinians. So let me again choose a different approach. I recall my visit to the Aida refugee camp near Bethlehem, where Palestinian expellees from 1948 were stranded. During my visit, 7 decades after the displacement, I heard a middle-aged man who was born in the camp say the words, "I am not from here." I recall the huge dark iron key on top of the entrance gate to the camp, a rusty symbol of hope for a return. Keys like this, in their distinct old-fashioned form, accompanied me throughout several countries when I was doing research for my book. In Vilnius, the Jewish painter Samuel Bach used the keys as a symbol of the liquidation of the Jewish ghetto and the indifference of Gentile Lithuanian neighbors. In the Museum of Treblinka, a couple of rusty keys testified to the hope of some deportees to return to something, even as they were entering the gas chamber. For me, all these keys point to fundamental differences and at the same time to a connection. And feeling such connections is the essence of what memory culture means to me. And if sensitivity is considered daring, something has gone very wrong. The exercise, understanding the pain of others, starts with the invitation, tell your story. My country never wanted to extend such an invitation to the 200,000 Palestinians who live in Germany, and they constitute the largest community of Palestinians in Europe. Official memory culture has no place for their biographies because Germany uses a passepartout for the founding of the Israeli state that only has room for the Shoah. The expulsion of Palestinians, if acknowledged at all, is nothing more than history's collateral damage, way beyond our capacity for empathy. And this is by no means logical. Precisely when the Holocaust is viewed, as Germans like to do, as the paramount reason for the founding of the state, the Nakba should be part of our history, part of a common history. Instead, Palestinians have to fit into the German passepartout and are obliged to see their suffering as the inevitable consequence of the much greater suffering of others. This does not work. Some shout out their rage on the streets, while others, the established in the community, prefer to remain silent so as not to jeopardize their reputation or professional future. And that is exactly the kind of muteness that Palestinian intellectual Raif Streik refers to when he says, it is impossible to develop a version of events that conforms to the prevailing grammar. So the grammar has to change. In my view, Palestinians in Germany should tell their side of the story as part of a newly understood culture of memory that overcomes exclusionary attitudes. There are, of course, strong obstacles to this, notably the German desire to see their relationship with Israel as an exclusive romance, a reconciliation miracle. Yes, Israel has rightly a special status for Germany, but there is something deeply tragic about this bond, as long as Israel routinely violates international law. To assume that Israel has a singular right to impunity because of the Shoah is a terrible misunderstanding. And what is memory culture worth without a commitment to the universality of human rights? I think with the new Israeli government, it is obvious that German policy must be redefined. Looking back to the early 50s, when the special relationship between West Germany and the young state of Israel began, I found an amazing combination of philo-Semitic and colonial undertones. In the German public discourse of that time, admiration for the so-called new Jews and their superior skills as pioneers went along with the image of a backward and detestable Arab society. Palestinians were seen as dirty, corrupt, uncivilized, typical Orientals who could only benefit from being dominated by Jewish taskmasters, who in turn were European or even better Germans, and who brought progress, efficiency, and cleanliness. These observers projected colonial fantasies onto the Jewish state at a time when most Germans openly preferred a country without Jews for themselves. Identifying with the Jewish civilizing mission was a guilt-free colonial pleasure. How could there be room to see the Nakba? Beyond question, the Holocaust is of an entirely different dimension and character than the Nakba. But Palestinians have been forced, for meanwhile 25 years, to pay the price for a European crime. The Germans of today are not directly to blame for what happened in 1948, for the expulsion of the Palestinians. But we are implicated through the burden of European anti-Semitism. With the Holocaust, the project Israel took on a significance for many Jews in terms of protection and identification that Zionism had not been able to generate before. I therefore think that arguing merely in the framework of settler colonialism is a false simplification. We cannot escape the complexity of history. When I advocate that Germans should understand the Nakba in the broader sense as part of their own history, I do not minimize Israel's direct responsibility. I simply want to confront our acquired blindness. And this is a term I recently learned from Jewish activists in Israel regarding the Nakba. The first step is to become conscious of a glaring asymmetry. Today, Germany lives on the sunny side of history. The Cold War frontline protected the Federal Republic from reparations, from revenge, from any profound consequences. That's why the obdurate silence could last so long, because the punishment for a crime that many Germans today like to call unique was almost neglectable, at least for the Wessis in Germany. Meanwhile, the Palestinians, as victims of history, continue to stand there empty-handed. I believe privilege is an obligation in addition to our historical involvement. So, Germans should finally stop seeking atonement at the expense of others. In my understanding of memory culture, all the ethical criteria I mentioned earlier apply to the Nakba, the question of belonging, of human equality, and of justice. Thank you.
Hello? What's the problem?
Continue. It just was I want to clap. I wanted to say who because it's ignorant and stupid what you said. Finish now.
Okay, you will have time to discuss. We hope respectfully. Stupid is sort of grenzwertig, on the border of disrespectful. But we will have time to discuss, as we do in the Einstein Forum. We'd first like to hear our two other speakers, Amos Goldberg from the Hebrew University Jerusalem and Bashir Bashir from the Open University in Jerusalem and the Van Leer Institute.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by expressing my admiration to Professor Susan Neiman and the Einstein Forum for hosting this event, which was originally, as we heard, planned to take place in Tel Aviv. I salute you for the courage, your academic leadership, and the determination to keep this important discussion going. But I also want to thank and express support to the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the Goethe Institute in Tel Aviv that were courageous to initiate this discussion, even if eventually they had to succumb to unbelievably enormous political pressure and literally violent threats, very violent. While reading Charlotte's excellent, nuanced, and very moving book, I could not avoid thinking how remote it is from the crude, political, polarized discourse that evolved around it in Israel. It opened news shows. This book touches on so many crucial issues, from processes of decolonization, as we've heard, to the Mizrahim in Israel, from the genocide in Rwanda, to the Oyneg Shabbos clandestine archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, and many, many others. And all this with admirable sensitivity, empathy, complexity, and devoid of all aggressiveness. The book has a super solid ethical and political backbone, but it found the precise tone comprised of a rich mosaic of voices with which to deal with issues that are extremely sensitive to many communities in very contradictory ways. In my very short talk, I will try to address one simple question: why? Why such a beautiful, well-written book created such an ugly havoc? As we've just heard, the basic framing of the book is the fundamental multidirectional entanglements of colonial, post and anti-colonial memories, and the memories of the Shoah. However, this evening is mostly dedicated to one particular case where these memories intersect and forcefully collide, perhaps, or not perhaps, in the most violent way, on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And on this issue, Bashir's and my ongoing, more than a decade now, joint project to think the Holocaust and the Nakba together come into very close dialogue with Charlotte's book. Again, it is important to stress that both projects don't compare or equate the two events, which are very different in nature and scale. But both projects insist that these two events, or at least their memories, should be put together into one discursive framework. This is so essential because, as Charlotte puts it, I quote, both narratives each neglect an important part of the story, and both, for all their incongruity, have something in common, namely a denial of the pain of the other. And I would add that it is not, as we've heard, it is not only about the pain and suffering, but also about rights, about human rights, international law, and of course responsibility, political responsibility. Putting them together seems as an essential ethical imperative. So why the havoc and rage? Let me begin with a quote. The history of of European Jewry and of the Arab of Eretz Israel, that means Palestine, those together became a focus of Judaism. The Shoah of European Jewry and the Shoah of the Arabs of Palestine are one Shoah of the Jewish people. They are both looking straight in the face. Who is this anti-Semite who not only put together in one sentence the catastrophe of the Jewish people and the catastrophe of the Palestinians, that is the Holocaust and the Nakba, but also called both a Shoah, a Holocaust, and asserted that both Holocausts are at the center of contemporary Jewish thought, and that together they combine one Holocaust of the Jewish people, one Holocaust in which the Jews are both victims and wrongdoers. Some of you might have recognized that these are the lines taken from the poem Hanmaka, Reasoning, written by one of the most important Israeli Hebrew poets, Avot Yeshurun, which was published in 1958 in his book, Hashever Asuri Afrikai, The Great Rift Valley. I want to focus a little bit on this, on him. Yeshurun was born as Yechiel Perlmutter in 1904 in the town of Nischish, which is now in Ukraine. In 1925, he emigrated as a Zionist to Palestine and severed all his ties with his family. He wanted to become a new Jew. His family were later all murdered in the Holocaust. This matter haunted him all his life, and his unique poetry expressed his grief and trauma. It is considered as perhaps the most post-traumatic poetry in modern Hebrew literature, as it actually breaks the Hebrew language, its grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and even spelling, and in a unique style combines Hebrew, Yiddish, and Arabic together into a new poetic language. He fought in 1948 and witnessed firsthand the Nakba. In 1952, Yeshurun published a poem, Pesach al Kuchim, Passover over Caves, which implicitly but unequivocally linked the destruction of European Jews to the destruction of the Palestinians. The core line in the poem, in my opinion, are, and I'll read it in Hebrew and then translate it, it's very difficult to translate. ואבא אמא מן מלכוח, אש על רב רבה למלכוח, ציוונו יהנדס לא לשכוח ועל פוילין לא לשכוח. And father, mother, from wherever they were taken to, from the horrendous fire of fires, order us not to forget, Yehandes, and Poilin also not to forget. And really, this is one of the biggest intellectuals of Israeli cultural life. Poilin is, of course, Poland in Yiddish, and Yehandes is also a Yiddish word that comes from the Hebrew word of Yahadut, Judaism. Its meaning, as Amos Noy recently showed, is traditional diasporic Jewish ethics that valorizes empathy and compassion and responsibility. The poem caused a big controversy, and in 1958, Yeshurun published another, much clearer poem in which he explained his position, Hanmaka, reasoning, from which we just quoted those powerful lines about the one Holocaust of the Jewish people. In 1992, Yeshurun won the Israel Prize, which is the most prestigious prize the state gives, for poetry, and in that very year, he also passed away. For Yeshurun, the intimate connection between the Holocaust and the Nakba, already in the 50s, was the center of contemporary Jewish thought and of Yehandes, that is, of Jewish ethics. But he was not the only one to associate the two in very many ways. Take a completely different example. Golda Meir was actually one of the more hawkish leaders of the Yeshuv, reported on May 6, 1948, to the Jewish Agency executive following a visit to the Arab Haifa only a few days after its conquest and the expulsion of the city Arab population. And this is what she said. She said, "There were houses where the coffee and pita bread were left on the table, and I could not avoid thinking that this indeed had been pictured in many Jewish towns," which means in Europe. Let me add one more quote, now reflecting on Primo Levi's famous book, If This Is a Man. And this is the quote. "Over the years, I noticed that the book, This Is a Man," I hope everybody knows what I'm talking about, "has an additional meaning that can be seen as a universal testimony about what a human being is capable of doing. And in this sense, the testimony does not only concern Germany," and I quote, and I skip, "the human being is not too violent, but too disciplined. He obeys and fulfills the orders of the Nazis, as the Nazis did," and I skip, "as the Americans did a little less in Vietnam, and as the Israelis today do today in Lebanon." That was 1982. These are the words of Primo Levi himself. Primo Levi, this is not an anti-Semite. In an interview he gave in 1982. In our co-edited book and in our joint work, we analyzed many more of this, of such instances. And this brings me to my core argument. From a Jewish history perspective, and actually from a historical perspective as such, the nexus and entanglements of the Holocaust and the ongoing Nakba, which continues till today, was the primary, intuitive, existential way of thinking for many of that generation. As these two events were so close in time, the Holocaust and the war in Europe ended in May 1945, as we all know, and the Nakba, which many consider, myself included, as an act of ethnic cleansing, took place just 3 years later, in 1948. Between a third and a half of the troops on the Jewish side were Holocaust survivors. So how could these two events not be associated with each other when they were so close in time and so dominant in Jewish experience of the 30s and the 40s and thereafter? This was just a natural world of association. Moreover, historically speaking, these events of the 30s and the 40s in Europe, the events in the 30s and the 40s in Europe, dramatically shaped the events in the Middle East, and vice versa, even if to a lesser extent. So how could these two events or historical processes can be completely separated? How could they not be? My question is not why to put them together. My question is, how can they be dealt separately? But then came the ever-growing political and psychological heavy denial and repression, which started already at the time. Powerful internal, individual, psychological, and external cultural, political, institutional mechanisms of denial were put into action in order to separate the two events and to make any connection between them a moral taboo, and actually to repress and deny the Nakba altogether. Mechanism that made us not see it for what it is. An example for this is the famous Israeli Holocaust historian, now teaching in Brown University, Omer Bartov, who is quoted in Charlotte's recent article called Trauma 1948. As children, we played near the so-called abandoned village, and we would never ask, where did the Arabs go? Why aren't they here? The state was, as it could not have been otherwise, a state with a Jewish majority. And for the long time, I had no idea how this majority came about. So what I suggest is that from a Jewish perspective, and I'm saying not only from a Jewish perspective, the nexus of Holocaust and Nakba was there first. And then logically and historically and politically came the repression and denial that only grew stronger and stronger and stronger. And when one touches such deep repression and denials, even if empathically and in an ethical way, as Charlotte does in her book, at least one chapter of a book, one gets a very aggressive and violent reaction. I believe that this can at least partially explain what happened around the cancelled event in Tel Aviv. And let me stress again, putting them together does not mean equating or even comparing them. It means finding an ethical and political, historical, discursive, and conceptual frameworks in which these two traumatic events, which shaped the history and identity of the two peoples, and actually of the three peoples, as the Germans, Charlotte, I have 2 more minutes. As Charlotte so persuasively indicates, are also completely complicit. They cannot be but discussed together. But denial and repression do not go without taking a very heavy price, because what is repressed is bound to return in the form of ever-growing symptoms, which become harsher and harsher. And the symptoms are now evident for all to see. Israel is becoming a non-democratic state, not even for Jews, in the form of Turkey and Hungary, and I hope you follow the news. It's not only about Ben Gvir in the government. It was about really collapsing all the democratic institutions and the making all one branch of a government. This is precisely why a vote, and there's a direct line, we can talk about it after, the direct line between this negation and repression. Precisely why Avot Yeshurun thought already in the 50s that the history of European Jewry and the Arab of Eretz Israel, Palestine, those together became focus of Judaism. So let me be very clear. In my opinion, there can be no Jewish ethics or modern history without putting the Nakba at its core. The Nakba is part of our challenge, is part of our history, and is part, and confronting it is the essential part of the Jewish ethics today. Obviously, there is also a Palestinian side to this intersection, which only partially overlaps with the Jewish or the German one. In my short presentation, I could not speak about it, and I am not sure I am entitled to speak about it here, but I will still mention some of the many Palestinians and Arab intellectuals who made these connections. Hassan Kanafani, Edward Said, Rashid Hussein, and Elias Khoury, who in his novels, since I think 1998, is obsessed with this connection, especially the last trilogy that two of it's already published. Also in our book, we mention other contributors analyze such texts and such writers. But I think what Bashir and I and Charlotte share is the notion that it is the time for Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians to follow Yeshurun's and these Arab intellectuals' imperative and find a way to look straight in the face of the Holocaust and the Nakba that always together stare back at us. I skipped because I already went over my time. I skip what it means for Germans, but maybe we can touch it in the discussion. But now I turn to Bashir to elaborate on the moral and political implication of this imperative. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Susan. This is a great honor, definitely at a time when there are aggressive, unbelievable, and unprecedented efforts to silence, discipline, police, and criminalize. Definitely open conversations, and definitely conversations that I and Amos at least believe that they are indispensable if we were to move towards serious issues of historical reconciliation and peace and justice. And in that sense, what I want to do, I am going to take very seriously Charlotte's call. And Charlotte, in her wonderful book and in her intervention today, is calling us to seriously entertain a new grammar, seriously to take the issue of what does it mean to come to terms with past injustices, and what does it mean to come to terms with atrocities and injustices. And this is exactly the crux of what Amos and I do in our project. Let me briefly summarize what Amos has said shortly in order to move very quickly to what I am going to say in the 15 minutes that I have here. Amos tried to establish that the Holocaust and the Nakba, their memory, are inseparable. And if this is a reasonable argument, and I think Amos and Charlotte in their own way try to make that kind of argument. If this is a reasonable argument, then what does it really imply? What does it really mean? And in my conversation today, or in my presentation today, I want to briefly elaborate on what it means to put these two traumas and their memories together in a conversation. And I want to do that by first making an overarching argument of where does this argument fit in the larger call for a new grammar. And then I want to focus on 6 points, if I may allow very briefly, so for the benefit of time. Now, when we call for a new grammar, and that's a very serious call by Charlotte, by introducing the ethical dimension and the moral dimension to the conversation, because it's not only to talk about memory and history, but it means what constructively it means to put these in conversation. And here there is a very bold, disruptive potential that is in the business of putting these together. Otherwise, we would have not had 500 people registering, and probably the majority of you would have stayed at home tonight. And this is precisely the point. Putting them together is not a convenient, easy story. It's very disruptive. It's very dismantling. It's very destabilizing. And otherwise, this would have not been a very productive type of engagement. But it's not for the sake of disruption only. The disruption is leading to empathy. And this is exactly what Susan was saying. Susan was stating the significance and the importance of disruptiveness in that empathy. It's not only about disruption, but it's also about empathy. And what does that mean if we were to be involved in that type of empathy? Empathy is a form of an effective relationship, from affection, okay? Effective relationship, bond with the other, while you are respecting the otherness of the other. That's exactly what makes it disruptive. It doesn't collapse into you. That's the difference between empathy and identification. And therefore, what does it mean to put the Holocaust and the Nakba together in the form of calling and coming that this conversation of putting them together is disruptive, but equally does not stop at the disruption. It's very productive. It's very transformative. It gives us a horizon. It invites us to look forward to a vision, to an ethical principle, to guiding principles along the ethical type of dimensions that Charlotte was kind of indicating. And this is exactly what Amos and I in our work call egalitarian binationalism. Putting the memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba together in a conversation, bearing in mind the stark differences and the asymmetries between both of these events, calls and invites for egalitarian binationalism, according to me and Amos. Then what I want to say is A, contextualize egalitarian binationalism in the larger grammar, and B, start with these 6 points that I want to do, and I promise I will be within the limit of time. The grammar that is there is that actually our intervention, and I want to see that the call for Charlotte's call is also that the dominant grammar, meaning the dominant vocabularies, terminologies, imaginaire that dominate our understanding when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and by extension reading Europe today and different parts of the world, is very limited. Some of these vocabularies are losing their capability to capture what is happening. Some of these notions, definitions, and terms are not capable to capture what is happening, not now, but for the past few decades. And therefore, we need to shift. We need to redefine, we need to revisit, we need to rethink and reconsider. We don't have to abandon everything, but we need definitely to be honest, to look at self in the mirror and see where some of these terms are not adequate, or they are at least losing some of their capacity to capture. And therefore, the dominant language and grammar that has dominated Israel-Palestine, through which there is an imaginaire that the conflict started in 1967, and disregarding the Palestinian Nakba and the Palestinian right of return, and thinking that the way forward is about racial segregation and Jewish supremacy and territorial partition, is not leading anywhere, but is putting us in a deadlock, to put it mildly, if I want to be politically correct. And therefore, the Israeli colonial settlements and many other things, the aggressive realities in Jerusalem, and the attempt to liquidate the right of Palestinian refugees to return by different types of things, all invite, and the dynamics of the Israeli politics that Amos alluded, as the Israeli politics is alluding today and happening in the past two decades, not only today, invites us at least to reflect on the terms that we use in order to navigate our way in the Israeli politics, understanding Israel-Palestine and understanding Europe, including German policy in this. And therefore, our intervention of putting the Holocaust and the Nakba together in a disruptive, destabilizing way for the purpose of envisioning some ethical guiding principles how to navigate our way comes as a contribution that leads into precisely this attempt. And I'm not saying, and Amos and I, under no circumstances, suggesting that our own efforts is the only way to navigate our way. We are populating that path of thinking differently, of coming up with a new language, of shifting the discourse and the paradigm with what we think the Holocaust and the Nakba is a key pillar that helps us in that. And that key pillar is basically what we call egalitarian binationalism. And egalitarian binationalism is the recognition and the promotion of the existing of two national groups with equal rights to self-determination. Now, and in that sense, this whole exercise of the buy in binationalism is premised on the ethical principles of parity, equality, mutual legitimacy. But to think that this is where the whole story ends is very problematic, because actually what I am trying to do in the 6 points that I want to do is precisely to say what it means when we speak about egalitarian binationalism. It's not enough to say that it's the recognition of self-determination for two national groups. The first point out of the 6 is that actually egalitarian binationalism is not a mere just description of basically what we have right now, which is basically, Jewish supremacist form of regime, where the Palestinians don't enjoy any form of equality of any sort, or surely not justice, and where there is a very clear Jewish preferences and privileges in the country. Therefore, we need to entail that it's not descriptive, but it's a normative, meaning it's a call for something that aspires for parity, equality, mutual legitimacy. So binationalism, extremely incredibly, is not only descriptive, but the egalitarian is unbelievable attachment to that, meaning insisting on equality as an entry to this. This is the first point. The second point that I want to make, that actually our call is a very bold departure from those who try to be apologetically trying to rethink Zionism or think Zionism as a Jewish and democratic state, as an ethnocracy. No, none of that is what we are trying to do, because all of these attempts try to liquidate in a way the principle of equality, the way we are insisting on it. And I am going to do this only very briefly for the purpose of trying to allow later on for questions and I want to move with the other points that I have here. The third point that I want to insist on, that actually when we say egalitarian binationalism and recognizing self-determination for both groups, under no circumstances we are calling here for the excessive celebration of liberalism, nor we are calling by German kind of attachment a celebration of, constitutional patriotism. These are incredibly important features. But actually, given the sensitivities that we know about the Jewish modern history, and given the sensitivities that we know about the Palestinian modern history, we are insisting on the entry of nationalism. And the entry of nationalism here is very important, and I want to explain it if I want to explain 3 dimensions in the entry of nationalism in this point. The entry of nationalism is incredibly important for the Palestinians. For much of their history, before the Nakba and after the Nakba, the Palestinians continued and suffered excessively from systems of denial, misrecognition, and negation of their identity. Palestinians didn't exist. Palestinians are terrorists. The land was empty. All of that kind of slogans were clearly the Balfour Declaration promising the indigenous land of the indigenous people to somebody who are coming from Europe. All of these kind of issues of negations and denial are very problematic. And therefore, trying to ask the Palestinians to distance themselves and abstract themselves and come to the conversation as liberal cosmopolitan agents is actually missing the point where the Palestinians are incredibly important about the issue of insisting on self-determination as a recognition of their identity, and therefore the national entry is incredibly important as an emancipatory, transformative form of principle, because it goes against those who are trying to deny their recognition as a nation, whether this is Zionism and later on the state of Israel, and by extension some Western countries and some Arab regimes. The national entry is incredibly important for Jews, and for Israeli Jews in particular. There are two usually arguments in favor of Jewish nationalism of some sort, with all the qualifications and the controversy that might be attached to Jewish nationalism. One, that the Jews need a safe home with a right of veto. Egalitarian binationalism, the way Amos and I conceptualize it, allows for this. Self-determination means a Jewish Israeli home with the right of veto on certain matters that matter for them. It also says basically the Jews are the second argument in favor of this, that the Jews entitled to be treated like other all nations, and by that extension to self-determination, having the right to egalitarian binationalism recognize that. But egalitarian binationalism, and by this I finish in relation to this point, does not mean that this whole exercise of insisting on the national entry is actually happening under the rubric of equality. But that this whole, not only at the rubric of equality, but this is an invitation that takes me to the fourth point that I want to make, that actually any attempt to move forward to the direction of egalitarian binationalism as a vision or as an ethical principle for Israel-Palestine will by definition, indispensably mean dismantling all and every single form of Jewish privilege and Jewish supremacy. Because the egalitarianism that invites here eliminates and liquidate all potentiality of any form of privilege and any form of superiority and supremacy. And therefore, this whole entire project is intimately connected to the issue of decolonization and historical reconciliation. This is exactly how nations embark on issues of coming to terms with past injustices or ongoing injustices. And therefore, it's incredibly important to understand that when we speak about egalitarian binationalism by insisting on the significance of national entry, that we are not trying to draw symmetry between the two nations, but actually insisting on the equality of the right, when the equality of the right needs to be realized in a very specific, particularized historical context, in which basically the intervention comes as putting an end and total end to any form of Jewish privilege and Jewish supremacy or Jewish Israeli supremacy. And therefore, this calls for basically reparation, inclusiveness along lines that are actually very much to come to terms with the ongoing consequences of the Nakba, chiefly among, most importantly, the right of Palestinian refugees to return. The fifth point that I want to make before the last is basically that intimately linked to this issue is that actually Zionism has been unbelievably revolutionary in modern Jewish life. It moved from insignificant minority view in Europe until the mid-30s into actually shaping and reshaping modern Jewish life. And the establishment of the State of Israel, at least for a very long time and until today, is perceived as providing some serious important achievements for for the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews and for Jews, many Jews in the world. But actually Zionism and the State of Israel have failed miserably to deliver two things. Israel is a very boosting economy, a nuclear weapon industry, big, flourishing country in terms of culture as well, revolutionized, Zionism revolutionized also the culture. We have to be acknowledging all of that. But equally, what Zionism and the State of Israel have failed miserably to deliver is that they don't enjoy legitimacy in the eyes of their victims, meaning they don't have legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinians, because the Palestinians will not grant that legitimacy as far as the Palestinians are not equal and they don't have their rights, all of their basic rights as individuals and as a collective, as a nation. And the second thing that Zionism and the State of Israel has miserably failed to deliver, that actually they are not having normalizations also in the eyes and at the midst of the Palestinians. They can normalize with Saudi Arabia if they want. I hope they wouldn't. But they can do that with with the Gulf countries and all of that stuff. But in the eyes of the Palestinians and every single Israeli Jews in the street, whenever he or she hears Arabic or sees the Palestinians, get disrupted. That's exactly the disruptive ethics that we are talking about. Because the existing arrangement is one of injustice, one of inequality, and one of Jewish supremacy and privilege. The last point that I want to make. For a very long time, or for the past few decades, settler colonialism has become a very fashionable term in reference to the Israel-Palestine. One of the departures that Amos and I do in our egalitarian binationalism is that we recognize and acknowledge significantly the value of bringing settler colonialism into the conversation. Settler colonialism, unlike peacemaking, depicting as if we are equalizing between the oppressed and the oppressor. This is nonsensical stuff, all this peace discourse. Settler colonialism brings to the equations that we are talking about asymmetrical colonial reality that is very much embedded in asymmetrical power relations. And it does many other things. But settler colonialism is not enough. Settler colonialism needs to be complemented with many other things. Among them, according to at least what Amos and I do, is the recognition that the Israeli Jews have managed to create a national identity and a nationalism in that country. And therefore, objectively and factually and sociologically, you need to engage with that. And part of the engagement within the rubric of egalitarian binationalism is actually also to recognize and to come to terms with that Jewish national Israeli presence in the land. That is obviously not without a process of dismantling all Jewish privileges or Israeli Jewish privilege, and not without the right of return, and not without a process of historical reconciliation. But it is an extremely important thing to understand and appreciate the value of settler colonialism, but not to stop at that point, but to move forward and say what does it mean, not only at the level of diagnosing, but at the level of prognosis. And what Amos and I try to do in this is actually precisely a very decent, modest contribution through a very sensitive entry that is the Holocaust and the Nakba and their memory. And under no circumstances, Amos and I believe for a second that what we do is not honoring the victims of the Holocaust and their memories and their pain, and surely not dishonoring, not dishonoring the Palestinian Nakba. The other way around. What we think, we do a great deal of sensitivity and honor to the memories of these traumas, knowing that they are different, but knowing that they are inseparable. And every single day that the reality in Israel-Palestine are showing how we are inseparable. And the last thing that I want to do in this is that I would be very happy to talk in the conversation with you about how all of this in Germany, how does Germany fit into all of this? Because I don't think this can be done without bringing back into the equation the Jewish question, without bringing down to the equation the interrogation of Europe today in its actually not only of forms of anti-Semitism, but also of its Islamophobia and the way the Palestinians feature and the Muslims feature in all of that. But I leave that for the questions. Thank you.
I want to thank all three of you, and I'm going to make an executive decision because we all talked more than we intended to. We all had a lot to say. I am going to go straight to you, the audience. We'll have a last round, the three of you, at the very end. I want to ask, I never thought I'd spend so much of my life as a police officer, but that's what a moderator has to do. The Einstein Forum sees itself as a place in which controversial questions can be discussed reasonably. So I'd like us to avoid, as far as we can, polemics. And the floor is open for questions and comments. I'd like you to make them as short as you possibly can. There are a lot of people who would like to comment, and there are 500 people online. We obviously won't get to all of them. So let me ask you to be short. Let me ask you to state your name when you stand up and say something. Wait for the mic so that everyone can hear you. And is there anything else? If I think of something else, I'll tell you. Okay, floor is open. Gentleman in the back who was distressed, yeah, you're welcome to.
Hello, my name is Konstantin Shkliar. First, I want to say it's really important. I let you finish, but I didn't want to clap, so I think it's really important to let the opponent finish. And I said, not maybe you heard that I said that you're stupid. No, I said that what you said, I think, is ignorant and stupid. Because in my opinion, just to say very short, I think the facts are true, but you always used, this is because the Germans are like this. You were using all this explanations that I think are very childish. And I didn't read your book, I just referred to what you said. But I think your
Talking
explanations...
about me, personally.
So, sorry?
Are you talking about me or Charlotte?
Charlotte, Miss Wiedemann. So I think, I just referred to what you said. I think what you said is stupid and ignorant because the facts are right. I totally agree with you on the facts, but your explanations are just childish and stupid and ignorant, what I think.
Okay, childish and stupid, by the way, is not a respectful form of discourse, whether you're referring to what someone said or their person. Doesn't matter. Could you please briefly state one point on which you would disagree with Charlotte's arguments?
I think there is a wide discourse in Germany, a huge discourse on how this memory culture is not working at all. That the Germans are using it wrong, that it doesn't work. There is a huge discussion, there's just a book that came out. You said that the Germans, because the Germans did it, they cannot allow Holocaust and Nakba be meant in one sentence. I think this is just like factually not true. But I think when you say consequences, that in the world, there is no history of remembrance. All the crimes of all the people in the world, they will never commemorate it in a good way. By saying that the Roma and Sinti were not commemorated in Shoah, you say that they were not commemorated because of racism. No, because the Jews had a strong lobby of commemorating the Holocaust. This is the first example in the human history that anybody started commemorating any crime. So if you say it's because they're racist or blah, 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 nobody, there is not a country that is...
Thanks. That's a coherent argument, Charlotte. Would you like to briefly answer it?
I don't want to start a discussion. I just wanted to make an example. And actually, I have a question, you know? Maybe for all the three of you. So I have two wonderful children with a German woman, and her ancestors were expelled from Ostpreußen, you know what I mean, in the war. There is literally very few commemoration of this event. I don't want to say, but nobody thinks about this because they don't suffer. My children don't suffer, but by this logic of the keys, you know, when you talk about the keys, their grandparents, of course they had their keys, they hope to return to Poland. But it is absurd to talk about empathy, about my children, that they have a right to return to Prussia, to Kaliningrad. This is absurd. And I think this is a very good point to show that the suffering... So my question is, do you think 2.4 million German refugees should have a right to return to Eastern Prussia?
Billion is wrong.
2.4 million Germans. Do we think they should have a right to return to Eastern Prussia?
That's a coherent question. I'm not going to ask all three people to answer anything because we'll never get anywhere. Charlotte, since it was mostly directed at you, would you like to answer?
Is this on?
Yes.
Yes. It's interesting that you said the expulsion of the ethnic Germans from the East doesn't matter. It's a sign that you are very young. Because I remember, so for decades, this was a very important topic in the German public. But I have to admit something, and I was just today in the morning thinking about it, because for me at the time, and I think also for others from my generation, so who were young then, the topic of the expulsion of the ethnic Germans was so much overshadowed by revisionist propaganda, by propaganda by their associations, but also in general. And so, for me at the time, it was difficult to see actually the suffering of those expellees. It was all so much politicized in a bad way. And you see, this led me in the morning when I was thinking about the discussion tonight. I thought, how is it from a Palestinian perspective when you have been witnessing always that the topic of the Holocaust is so much, from a Palestinian view, is so much politicized and also misused for the oppression of the Palestinians. So is it possible for a Palestinian to see the Jewish suffering and the Shoah just as a pure fact? So if I compare this to my own ability to see the suffering of the ethnic German expellees in the 50s or 60s because of the politicization of the topic, I am not sure if I put myself now, like understand the pain of the others, if I put myself in the shoes of a Palestinian woman, if I would be able to see the Shoah in that way as I am seeing it now as a German.
Other comments or questions? Wow. We thought, yeah, okay, good. There is actually another seat or two in this room if anybody wants to take it, but if you see somebody, great.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Michaela Kopsa-Mark. So I haven't read either of your books yet, but I'm really interested in the concrete Umsetzung of how you foresee this. I mean, you spoke about a new grammar, but I'm very interested because empathy is not something that's necessarily created by giving people access to facts or informations. You know, like when we get new facts, new informations, we process them in different ways through denialism, outrage, maybe over-rationalization. So what are the concrete structures that you can envision in order to breed an actual empathy and not just discourses that may or may not resonate with certain people? Thank you.
I didn't get the question.
It's on?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very, very challenging question, and it's a very good question. And I think I just want to answer this question by putting what we think is potentially coming to terms with a historical reconciliation process premised on decolonization, as opposed to what? And what is dominant today for the past 2 decades, has been this question or this industry of peacemaking. And this peacemaking actually has been so much invested in, you know, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, not less, maybe tens of millions of dollars. Europeans, many others are pouring money into this kind of people-to-people types of things. You know, let us talk dialogue. A Palestinian cannot appear on a podium in Germany without having an Israeli to actually neutralize him. You know, all of these types of equalizing between two strikingly unequal issues where you actually blur the boundaries between an occupied and an occupier, where you think by saying we can do things jointly, when you neutralize through the jointly the issues of the asymmetry of power is extremely and incredibly problematic. And therefore, those who have been in Israel-Palestine very much vested in this kind of language of peacemaking are now in a very serious trouble point, not now, for the past 10 years, I believe, through which actually they are starting to say, okay, this is not really working. Because, and why? It's not a surprise why it's not working. Because it's not premised on reading the reality differently, on actually reading the history differently. And this is exactly what we try to do. Now, you are very right, in our joint work, we don't name specifically the mechanisms. A, because maybe we didn't have enough time, but also B, because we are not experts on that, but that's not a satisfactory question, a satisfactory answer. There are attempts that are being done. And the fact that Amos surveyed what has happened in many of these kind of dimensions of literature and poetry, and what Amos alluded to through Rashid Hussein in his poetry, Mahmoud Darwish in his poetry, Edward Said in his writings, and surely Ilyas Khoury in his literature as a Lebanese novelist. There are attempts in the cultural scene, okay? Now, how does that gonna inspire politics and movements that will come together in order to promote Arab-Jewish partnership that is premised on the principle of egalitarian binationalism? This is a very hard work.
some partly done through Zokhrot. I don't know if you know, Zokhrot is trying to flirt with these types of idea, but any future solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is geared towards peace will have to start from what it is, where it is painful, and that's exactly the sensitive issues of the Holocaust and the Nakba, and many other issues that are related to that. Now, what are the exact mechanisms? The historical examples up to this point with a great deal of critique is called historical reconciliatory process, truth commissions, etc., etc. But this is not an intervention that comes surgically at one point. These are incremental historical issues. And the incremental historical issues that we are talking about is that there are very bold signs in the history of these two nations where people try to think about that. How are we going to translate this into concrete mechanisms and concrete, agents out there that carry this project? I think we are in a critical moment where today, at least, to come with this intervention, it's much more reasonable, because I think even German diplomats understand today that the window of opportunity for this discourse of separation and segregation and this two-state solution type of discourse. I'm not against the two-state solution, but I'm against the Israeli two-state solution, because the Israeli two-state solution is not two-state solution. It's Palestinian Bantustans with autonomy. And therefore, if that is reasonable, and I think you will find the overwhelming majority of mainstream politicians in the West and in the US to suggest that it is not reasonable, or at least we are losing time, then we are remained and left with a reality of an apartheid, of a Jewish supremacy, where the only future to move out of it is to move to Arab-Jewish equality and to our Arab-Jewish partnership, focusing and going back to the roots of things, including the Holocaust and the Nakba, and this is my answer to this briefly.
Dominic, do we have any questions? And by the way, I'd like to tell people online, Dominic Bonfilio is a professional translator. Yes. But let me just finish saying...
Can I also answer
Yes,
that?
yes, but can I finish saying what I want to say to the people online, which is that if you want to ask a question or make a comment in German, Dominic is a professional translator and he will translate it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. I want to compliment what I completely agree with what Bashir said, and I want to say something about, let's start, I think nobody knows what is the path, the political path through, because the political forces against such ideas are huge. I can say in my society, in the Israeli society, we see it over and over. They are huge. And today what you have in Israel-Palestine is actually a one dominate state with various rights of various levels of rights. Today there are more or less 51% between the river and the sea, 51% Arabs, and 49, almost 50-50, perhaps it already flipped to 51-49. So there's more or less half with full rights and half with various less rights to not rights. So, and this cannot stay. There's no, so it might be going, it will go somewhere at a certain point. So it's either this or a second Nakba, on which I can recall even 3 ministers in the current Israeli government that mention it out loud explicitly. So it can go there as well. So now I come to, I think when we say how does this mechanism, how does these ideas turn into political mechanism, it is much, and since the Jews in Israel have so many privileges to give up in any settlement of such as we suggest, it will not come from the inside. And this is where Germany and now Germany is really the sensitivity that Germans need in order to talk about those issues. I think Charlotte is a great example how to do it, but it can only come from the outside. And this is part of what we do, why we do here. It can only come from the outside. to making sense that advocating for equality, emancipatory values, emancipation, which is in the basis of modernity, I would say at least enlightenment, that this place is upholder of, is not anti-Semitic. On the contrary, it's anti-Semitic because anti-Semitism was always emancipatory movement and against discriminatory and violent discriminations of minorities in Europe. So I think part of the question is that in Germany, such issues will not be considered and silenced under the ban of anti-Semitism, as some very prominent politicians and those who are responsible for the discourse on anti-Semitism promote day and night. So let's start with that. Okay, I'll stop here.
Dominic, could you take a couple of comments or questions together? Oh, sorry, is that too loud?
No, I was too loud. Sorry about that. Yeah, I have 3 questions that are more or less all about the how to move forward in Israel today. The one question is it possible that what was attempted in the previous Israeli government, Arab parties in the Knesset, could this be the first step to egalitarian binationalism?
The previous government?
Wait, let's get all of these questions together.
Yeah, I didn't get it.
The previous Israeli government. Okay. The second question is a demand for a two-state solution as a way forward toward peace still realistic today? And the third question is kind of related to this. What is more realistic from today's perspective, a two-state or a one-state solution? Do they agree with the opinion of some that the two-state solution is no longer realistic? So,
could I get short answers from each of you? Those are difficult questions. We could spend the entire evening on one of them. So, you got a Bashir. You got a
Very briefly, I mean, definitely the egalitarian binationalism, Amos and I do. This is a point I didn't mention, although I was listing in there. There are many points can be cashed out in multiple, institutional and constitutional modalities. It doesn't have really to be against the two-state solution. It could be two-state solution. It could be confederation. It could be federation. It could be one state in a form of a kind of a binational government. But the point that I'm trying to make here, that is, we should not distance ourselves that easily from the two-state solution, not because I believe the two-state solution is realizable. Because one of the things that you need to bear in mind is what is this two-state solution that we are talking about? Because if we empty and hollow the notion of state from any Westphalian or even post-Westphalian notions of sovereignty and all of that stuff, and then you sell it to the Palestinian and pay lip service to the issue of two-state solution, when the Israeli colonial expansion in the West Bank is like cancerous cells in the body of the Palestinians, making the Palestinian territorial integrity impossible, then we need to confront that. Now, I think that the Palestinians can live with many solutions. I think it's the Israelis who are having very serious difficulties with which solutions they want to live. And I think, again, this is not a call against the two-state solution. We are happy to have the two-state solution, but any form of two-state solution will have to be featured, in my point of view at least, that this land is inseparable the way they think this. There has to be mechanisms of cooperation. Even the partition plan spoke about one economy, Jerusalem International, or one currency, etc., etc. So I think we need to navigate our way, but we are losing, and this is by this I finish. We are losing very serious time in the issue in relation to the two-state solution, and we are collapsing now into an apartheid. And it's no coincidence that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are starting to designate this as the reality that we have in relation to what Israel has created as irreversible facts on the ground of colonial settlements.
Would either of you like to add to Bashir's statement?
Yeah, I just want to say to your questions about the previous Israeli government, the answer is no. That was short, right? Now
Thank you.
I think what in the nobody knows what the way out. Nobody really knows what the way out is. I will just say that in Jewish and even Zionist history, there is a Jewish and Zionist history, there are precedented cases of egalitarian national ideology, whether it was this diasporic nationalism of the Bund in East Europe, that of course has to be some of its ideas has to be taken and adopted, and also in Zionism, as Dmitry Shumsky, my colleague in the Hebrew University, showed, that the idea, many of the ideologists and the leaders of Zionism until the 30s thought in an egalitarian binational frameworks. And we should go back, but really, as Bashir stressed, egalitarian is not half egalitarian, it's complete egalitarian.
By the way, Albert Einstein was in favor of a binational solution, for whatever authority that has. There was a hand in the back somewhere? No. Eran, did you want to make a comment?
It's more one.
Okay, so you first, and then, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. But,
my question is about the German role, our role, my role, in this play, all this power play and all this terrible inability or difficulty to feel the other's pain. Because I don't know exactly what can be our role or my role. I'll tell you the background. Because you know, am deutschen Wesen soll die Welt genesen, the German who know everything better. You know this saying, I don't know who can translate it by the German character, the world should be healed, is one of these terrible ideas which have a long tradition in our also colonist country. And my experience after having worked sometimes with refugees and citizens of residents of Lebanon about the civil war there, and empathy also with the occupiers, which has been possible. I'm working with psychodrama and playback theater. It was possible for Palestinians to be in the role of Israeli soldiers and to feel the fear in the confrontation. We have had this experience, but it was not possible to speak about that publicly because there is no safe place. It was possible to work with the people from Israel, from a common team we had, to work on empathy with Lebanese colleagues which had been bombed by the fathers and brothers and sometimes of these participants also. It was possible, but it was impossible to speak about it publicly. And on this background, I don't know whether the jump is too big. My question is, I didn't really understand this idea of the egalitarian nationalism. Binationalism, yeah. I really didn't, I didn't know this concept, and I was a bit like, well. So my European experience is that nations had, or hopefully have the tendency to be more dissolved, that power relationships are not decided in the generalization of nation. Like, for example, like in Lebanon, nobody speaks of Israel, you have to say Palestine, otherwise it's very difficult. So this concept of nation, I'm afraid might hinder the understanding of asymmetry, power relationships and the situational power relationships in encounters of those who maybe are even interested to feel the pain of the others. So I'm afraid of even if it's egalitarian, that means very reflective, very complex thing. Even then, how can we be open to intersectional reflection of power relationships and really feeling, not only understanding, knowing, feeling the other's side. But I don't want to be this European who says we know now how it goes and an deutschen Wesen soll die Welt gewesen. I don't know whether I could explain myself.
Yeah, I clearly would like to contradict both of your ideas, because in my concept, it's not feeling the pain of the other. I mean, the German title is begreifen, so it is understanding, grasping, comprehending. And so this is foremost an intellectual act, as I said. And also, I think empathy is not a method or an instrument so to overcome structural injustice. So actually, the example you mentioned, from Lebanon, I can't really go with you there. And as I said earlier in my keynote, I think empathy can lead or can show a path towards overcoming structural injustice. But I feel a bit uncomfortable with applying concepts of empathy right away in a situation where the asymmetry of power and of rights is so obvious. And secondly, I think, of course, in general, I also have a lot of sympathy for any post-nationalism. But in the context of Israel-Palestine, firstly, I mean, Palestinians have been denied their right to be a nation. And if we take the definition of a nation, which is formed through a certain history or destiny, then of course, what happened since the Nakba has made the Palestinians very much a nation. Secondly, I think, as Bashir said, the important point of their concept of binationalism is that also Bashir, as a Palestinian, said we recognize the Jewish right of national self-determination, which is very often, to my knowledge, excluded when we have a discourse about settler colonialism. Then the question is always open, what should happen to the colonizers? And this is a very weak and also dangerous point, in my view, in this discourse. So that's my question, is both no.
Does one of you also?
Yes, very briefly, if you don't mind. You know, very quickly, two points. First of all, when I was referring, I insist that all of what I said in relation to Jews refers to Israeli Jews. I don't talk about the Jews as such. I refer to Israeli Jews, and I think when we speak about self-determination, national self-determination, we refer to the Israeli Jews are entitled to self-determination. We are not talking, this is incredibly important, and under conditions of decolonization and historical injustice. But let me say, I mean, for me, also, if I may say what to expect from Germany, if you don't mind. You know, I think there are many Germanys, if I am allowed, at least this is my understanding, and this is how I experience Germany from distance and from close. There are different faces to Germany. One phase of Germany is this commitment to liberal, democratic values through which they fashion themselves in a very, kind of, let us call it cosmopolitan ethics, where the Holocaust features and the Jew feature as an incredibly important figure there. This is one face of Germany. This face of Germany needs to be subject to interrogation, reflections. There are incredible achievements that the Germans have achieved on that track. But it's about time also that the Germans look at themselves with this face into the mirror, interrogated it, looking at it, doing partly what Charlotte was saying. What about the minorities inside Germany? Not only the Palestinians, the Turks and many other minorities. What about Germany's responsibilities vis-a-vis the Palestinians? What about the silencing, disciplining, policing, criminalizing voices that speak in favor of what? A crime. What is that crime? Equality. Speaking in favor of justice, that's a crime? I think that's a face of Germany that I think I want to see myself very seriously partnering with that face of Germany.
But I want that partnering phase of Germany to meet me at a point where they do that kind of disruptive kind of ethics through which we can embark jointly, together with the Israelis, the Palestinians, where we interrogate fascism, when we fight together and jointly against injustices and in favor of equality. This is exactly what distinguishes and what defines today progressive left-leaning politics and liberal politics. Commitment to equality, liberty, and social justice. And all of these three elements are structurally eliminated in Israel, where you promote the opposite of that, where you have a Jewish supremacist form of regime. This is the type of Germany that I would like to partner with, but that requires some serious reflections, and let alone those who want to criminalize, and that's definitely not partners for this conversation.
Iran Scherf, and then this gentleman here, but Iran has been waiting here.
Yeah, I kind of very appreciate the pragmatic direction that the discussion is taking. Feels sometimes like in peace talks, but I do want to pick up the notion of grammar that you mentioned first, I think, Charlotte Wiedemann, which means okay. So you mentioned it in referring to them. Okay, that's fine. Grammar. This means a new grammar means a whole language, means like a very great change. Right? And I wonder if you could elaborate on this a bit more and how, for example, translation is maybe part of it. And another question that relates to it, you do pick the national, the notion of the national in the binationalism. And I wonder if this is not anachronic in a certain way, because, you know, it's an idea that hovers around since very long time, and I mean, already the nationalization of Israel was a very late example of it.
We're officially 10 minutes over time, and I know that still a few people would like to say something. So can I ask for one short answer from the person who most wants to answer this question?
I want to answer this question. And very shortly, I mean, I would say in linguistic terms, it's turning from a discourse of metaphor that one comes instead of the others, as I would say Lacanian theory articulates, and then you get the symptom to a metonym, that one is connected by nexus to the other. So those are two very different forms of tropes that linguistics evoke, and I think instead of one instead of the other, it should be the new grammar is one in nexus to the other, in a metonymic continuity.
Dominic just informed me that there are a number of people online who would like to jump in. I see you. I saw the woman back there. You'll all get a chance to say something, but let's have some comments or questions from the.
This is a question on a more personal note. This is from a German citizen with Palestinian roots, and asking. Yeah. Sorry, I don't think is the microphone on now? No. Okay, thank you. Wondering about, like, she feels very often that her criticisms of Israel in Germany are kind of labeled as anti-Semitic. And basically the question is, do the panelists believe that criticism is being used too easily in Germany, too quickly? And whether or not you feel that way, what she should do about this kind of positioning. Yeah.
If I could make a suggestion, all of the talks of our conference addressing that question, hijacking memory, last summer are on the website of the Einstein Forum and available. That's the beginning of an answer. Of course, it's a phenomenon. But do you want to read a couple of other questions and comments?
I'll try to keep it real quick.
Yeah.
The other questions, the idea of that there's something about trauma suffered by people that's intergenerational. So the idea is somehow that the Jewish people picked up on the traumas of the Holocaust and they're kind of living it psychologically today in their inability to recognize the trauma of the Palestinians. And the question was whether there's good literature, in your view, on how to kind of bring people to understand the trauma that's blocking them from seeing other people's trauma. And then there was a question about the fact that the Jews became the focal point of German remembrance culture after the war. And I think there was the person who posed the question understood that Frau Wiedemann believed that they became the focal point because of their proximity to being European. They said that they somehow sort of post-war became white, as it were, and that's why they were seen as the main victims, whereas the non-white victims, or the people that remained non-white after the war, still weren't given the attention that they deserved. But then the question was, well, why about the Germans who were clearly white, who were politically prosecuted, like under the pink triangle laws, why they weren't given the focus after the war, why it was primarily the Jews.
Do you want to start with that question, and then the other two can take the other two?
Yeah. So there might also be kind of misunderstanding because we should know that for a long time after 1945, the Holocaust was not at all in the center of the attention of any memory culture. There was no memory culture at all in Germany, firstly, and also elsewhere. It took quite a long time until the Holocaust became the importance it is having now. And for example, Primo Levi's book, when he tried to publish it in Italy, he only found a very, very small publisher because it was not considered to be important first. And I would not like, so my comments were for the present time. I think nowadays we have a situation that we have this kind of rather philo-Semitic German memory culture, and many Germans really think they can understand the Jewish pain, which I find a little bit embarrassing when they really think they can put themselves in the shoes of Jews at that time when they're persecuted. But still, there's always maybe a good reason for some to see themselves. It's perhaps a wrong understanding of empathy. But I would rather be very cautious with any kind of seeing Jews as white or not. Because, I mean, for sure, during the time of the Holocaust, from the side of the perpetrators, they were usually not seen as white. Exactly. So that's, for this reason, I think we should be very cautious with this kind of things. What I was saying is that after a couple of decades of this kind of memory culture, it has, in my view, the outcome that we haven't come closer to any understanding of being on equal footing with different groups of victims. And this is the way how then, from the German majority society's perception, Jews are kind of singled out as the ideal victim, so to speak.
Bashir, do you want to answer the question of the...
I mean, the issue of anti-Semitism, I mean, first of all, anti-Semitism is real. It is something that is disgusting, disgraceful, and need to be fought in all fashions possible within at the disposal of those who are against it, and it's a moral, defensible position to be against it in all possible fashions. But I think what has become troubling in this country and elsewhere is basically the use and abuse of anti-Semitism as a really accusation in order to silence and in order to police. That is, I think, what is really troubling. And the IRA definition, and Amos can attest to this better than I do, is really troubling in that sense. And I think this Palestinian feel criminalized, feel terrified. There is a politics of fear in this country that is generated by this kind of policing. And I think it's about time. And this is exactly the face of Germany that I was calling, that I want to call with, that I want to partner with. But they need to be subjugated to reference, where they have to understand that actually today, in addition to what they have done as a remarkable journey that they have went through, I think that is limited, one thing, if they don't bring the figure of the Palestinian as a symbol. The Palestinian identity is today, in relation to Germany, and definitely in relation to American Jews and many others, is a signifier and a marker of interrogation when it comes to the consistency of your commitment to liberal principles of equality, justice, and freedom. And I think this is what needs to be in this country in relation, and if this country, in its policy, in its civil society, in its intellectual elites, is committed to promote these principles and these values, it's about time that they revise and reconsider and rethink their positioning with this question and reflect on this politics of fear through which they want to burden a Palestinian community here or a Muslim community to come with this atonement and guilt of these types of things. And I think these discussions definitely with hijacking memory, you were definitely talking about that. Yes. But I think this is the type of where I think for me, and by this I finish, it's an incredibly important conversation because this is the first time that we come to Germany to speak about. And I think I would like these conversations to further go along these types of line and opening with openness. I'm not saying that I have, decisive, exhaustive answers to these types of things. But I think if you want to, if those who are interested in these conversations, they have to meet us at some point with a little bit of frankness, openness, and self-critique, as much as we do in relation to these types of things.
Even though 40 people were at the conference Hijacking Memory, we obviously couldn't invite everyone. One person who I wish we could have invited especially, but his book only came out after the conference. I'd like to recommend it to anyone who's interested in the question of the instrumentalization of the claim of anti-Semitism. It's by Anthony Lehrman. It's called Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, and it's a terrific book about just this problem. Amos, do you want to say something brief? This is my policeman hat now, because there are a lot of people who'd like to make comments, and the hour is late.
Yeah, so
short,
two very short comments. One, there's a very good reason why the Holocaust is in the center of Germany today, and I don't think it should change. There are good reasons for that. But it should become, as Bashir said, and as Charlotte said, and I say, a symbol of emancipatory values, not... This is, you have symbols, not for hierarchy, but to promote emancipatory values, also in Israel-Palestine. This is one thing. The second thing about anti-Semitism, this is really, I don't know if she's still here. There are people here who work, and I very much involved in this, but you have to speak up against the misuse and abuse of anti-Semitism, and it's hard, and you have to find a sensitive way to do it, to distinguish between real anti-Semitism and the political abuse of the term in order to protect criminal policies of Israel and even Zionism as a national ideology that has to be an object of scrutiny and criticism. So this is up to you to fight back against this. I know the huge forces here in Germany. I know them very well, but this is about getting things right.
Okay. There are three gentlemen sitting behind each other, and I'm going to let them go 1, 2, 3, and then the woman in the back, and that's it, guys.
Yeah, thank you. very much. Can I turn back a little bit to your concept of egalitarian binationalism and away from the German debate? What I'm not struggling with, but I'm curious about how much this national position that you put so strongly in your argument, would that particularly include, and how could that include people who are not in Israel-Palestine? So the big, what we saw, diasporic communities, both of Palestinians and of Jews. Are all Jews then part of this narrative of this nationalism? This is also what the Zionist dream at one point envisioned. Or is there room for maybe different nationalisms within these concepts of what is meant to be Palestinian, what is meant to be Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Israeli? Where can you? Thank you. Sure.
Yes, thank you very much for your wonderful presentations and approaches. I have also a question on a quite hopefully practical level on egalitarian binationalism for the discussion, for the discourse in Germany. I think there could be an intervention for people always, to stress, look also at the Palestinians in mainstream discussions about Israel or so. So my idea would be on a soft way, not always to have these fights where you have the different battalions against each other, but just to say there is this subject, there's this discussion about Israel, so let's just also mention what is about the Palestinians, and to combine also directly this struggle against anti-Semitism with the solidarity in the sense of this egalitarian binationalism, and also in contact with those, and Charlotte does that very nicely, in confrontation and discourse, not only confrontation, with those who have another opinion. And also, and there's, and I think it's very important to be quite quick and to have interventions like, for example, the open letter that Susan Neiman and others published right now, inspired by Meron Mendel, etc., against the fascist danger for what is democratic, for those institutions in Israel that are democratic. And I think these interventions are very important, and to raise awareness in Germany also on a lower level. Yes, thank you very much.
Hi. I try to articulate it very fast. So the question is to Amos Goldberg and Bashir Bashir concerning the plan, which I really in favor and in solidarity and with you. The region the Middle East has changed very, very fast in the last years. I don't talk about Israel, I actually talk about the Abraham Accords, now the agreements with Lebanon, and economically, which is something that I'm not so professionalized in. I really want to ask, like, what they define in Israel as left, it's obviously center-right, right? Like, there is no left. And it's very neoliberal world there, meaning people that pretend to stand for leftist values are actually wanting, they are talking about, they want to have a certain peace, but they are actually not standing to these values. So I ask seriously, also for myself, so how do we advocate your plan, and how, and do we have a partner there to talk with while they are so much into a certain profit with the Gulf countries and with cyber economy, etc., etc.? How do we talk to those people?
Last question, then you all get around to reply.
Thank you so much for your really important interventions, both tonight and in your books. I guess my question is just, in light of the current climate of censorship in Germany, how do you really see the solidarity with Palestinians that continues to be attacked? How do you see that changing in action? Because I would love to be a part of that. I'm only here temporarily, but I've seen with my students both here and in the United States that when I bring even the term Nakba into the classroom, it's unrecognized by so many of them, and that's shocking and horrible. And then my second question, if there's time, is just I would be curious to hear from Charlotte and Bashir, since your opinions about the relevance and significance of settler colonialism discourse differ, just if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Give it a try. All very interesting comments, and none of them really answerable in short.
I think one indirect answer to the question of censorship is that I have a very good reception of my book. I get many invitations, more than I can take. And so with relation to what Bashir said about different phases of German society, in my experience, that phase, which is shown through a certain hostile discourse, is very different from experience I have when I meet civil society groups on the municipal level, and I feel there's a rather great openness to do what Bashir said, is so to interrogate and look into the mirror and to see what has to be done. But still, with regards to Palestinian voices, I feel now the problem that when I talk about the inclusion of the Palestinian story into the German memory culture, I raise a lot of expectations. I'm now being asked to do a lot of things also regarding the 25th anniversary of the Nakba, which is approaching this year in May. And there is a problem that people tell me, okay, you can say things which a Palestinian couldn't say. And I hear something similar with regards to my book, when somebody tells me, you can say things which a black person couldn't say. So I'm asking myself, what actually is my own role? So I try to support the opening of doors, but I think one also has the obligation then not to stand just in the door, but to make it possible that, in this case, Palestinians speak out for themselves. And so I would like to ask you, where you live during the next month, and you see there are efforts so to make public debates about the Nakba, and there are efforts in several cities. So please try to support this. So try to support the way of opening up the climate. And I am quite optimistic that it is possible, but it needs a joint effort. Thank you.
I'd like to echo Charlotte's remarks from my own experience. I can't tell you how many times, number one, I've given a talk and somebody's come up to me and said, I wish I could say what you did, but you're Jewish and you can get away with it. And I understand, I've spent an unbelievable amount of my life thinking about Deutsche Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. I really do know how complicated this is and writing about it. But my response would also be just do it. The other thing that often happens to me, and you know, I like flattery as much as the next person. Amos very kindly thanked me for being courageous, and I've heard, you know, that I'm mutig. And I really want to say, I'm sorry, the people who are courageous are in Iran right now, and a few other places in the world, okay? And it's not that I've had no repercussions. I have. There's stuff that's happened to me that since I began to speak out very actively in the last 2 years on these questions. But seriously, compared to people who are risking their lives to fight oppression and censorship and tyranny, you know, getting a shitstorm on Twitter or even having a project taken away from you is really not so hard. All of us can do that.
Yeah, very.
Just to add one word, Susan. I mean, so for Palestinians in German, it also means losing
their jobs.
So their jobs, and this is something
I know.
different.
And, by the way, no, I actually want to say yes. Yes, Palestinians have had it the worst in this country. There's no question about that. All right, I don't want to deny that. But Israelis have lost projects, have lost funding, have been, you know, banned from. I mean, let's remember, this is not just about Palestinians, it's also about left-wing Jews and Israelis who have not had it, you know, the repercussions are not as bad as they are for Palestinians, but there are genuine repercussions. All I'm saying is, you know, unless really your only job and your family's, you know, income is absolutely for sure on the line, there's a lot that people can do.
Very, very quickly, the gentleman about egalitarian binationalism in relations to the identities. You know, clearly the Palestinian refugees are the victim of this whole entire project, and if you survey the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian refugees, they see themselves Palestinians. They are parcel of the national Palestinian movement, and actually there would have been no Palestinian national movement post-Nakba time if you would have not had refugee camps, and the refugee camps and the founding fathers of Palestinian nationalism post-Nakba time, the overwhelming majority of them are refugees themselves, and therefore when I speak about refugees and the right of return and the whole body of Palestinian politics, if there is a dispersion of Palestinian politics, that is because the cause of that is basically Zionism and the State of Israel. That's definitely not the case about Jews. When I see and insist that it's about Israeli Jews, I am not reducing Jewish identity to Jewish Israeli identity. Today, I think one of the most interesting things that Zionism has made successfully, but I think tragically, is reduce the possibility of what it means to be a Jew in modern life. Instead of being socialist, cosmopolitan, you know, non-nationalist or whatever, Zionism reduced it to be actually in a very exclusionist form of ethno-nationalism. That's not good news, and I think that is being revoked today in the US, and it's about time that that penetrates into the German scene. And in that sense, no, under no circumstances, I'm not talking about self-determination for Jews. I'm talking about for self-determination of Israeli Jews under very particular conditions of, this decolonization and historical reconciliation. That is not to suggest that I am ignorant or insensitive to the sensitivities of legacies of anti-Semitism persecutions that penetrates the psyche of the intergenerational traumas of Jews. And in that sense, I have no problem whatsoever in the future state that will be closed in the constitutions that say any persecuted community of Jews, this new country will open its door and will give it a priority. But under no circumstances, this is going to be a principled fight of including Jews under the one rubric. I think this is what is happening today, luckily, in quarters of Jews in the US where they are saying, no, I'm not an Israeli, I don't want to be reduced to Zionist. Not all of them are anti-Zionist. Some of them, they don't want to be. Therefore, I am actually, this conversation is calling for opening up the spectrum of what it means to be, and I want to see these people as my partners. And in relation to the gentleman about the Israelis, I think Israel is going through, and this is the last point that I want to make, Israel is going through a very interesting point of time. It's about time that this bluff that is called Zionist left is about time that we look at it and we put it into serious interrogation. If the left is anything about it left, it's its commitment to liberty, social justice, and equality. That is not the commitment of the Israeli left. The commitment of Israeli left is to segregation and نحن بوضعهم شام. It's about partition, and it's about time that egalitarian binationalism as a principle that Amos and I promote, but also others have come with, Amnon Ras Karakotsky, many others, people have come. They don't necessarily say that this is the only game in town. It says that it is a potential principle that we can work with, through which we can envision Arab-Jewish partnership, and I am not apologetic about that. That's a beautiful thing to aspire for, but not to have them, not Arab-Jewish partnership of this previous government having Arab members as accessories and being, sorry. Arabs and Jews can exist as a master and slaves. This is not what we are calling for. We are calling for egalitarian form of politics that actually disrupts the existing types of inequality. And the last thing that I want to say in this relation, Palestine is a global signifier today. There is a very great deal of solidarity everywhere, by Jews and non-Jews. But also, while the world is being Palestinized, the world is being also Palestinized in the way that actually Palestine has become a body and a form through which Israelis are exercising technologies of surveillance and oppression, through which Israel is booming in its market through actually globalizing that industry. This is not the type of globalized Palestine that I would like to see. The global Palestine that I want to see is Susan partner with it, Charlotte is partner with it, and you are, if you want to rethink the left in Israel, you are welcome to join. And you, if you are a German, as looking into the screen and saying there is the ultimate figure for your culture of memory is not only the Jew, but you are actually making that achievement that you have made and is spending and opening the space up for rethinking and reflectively, you are my partner. And in this sense, we are all partners, and this is not all about the Palestinians and Palestine. This is all about an agenda through which you are committed to basic principles that have become now accusation of anti-Semitism if you are committed to them. What's wrong with equality, social justice, and liberty? The Palestinian cause is all about that, and this is where Palestine is a global issue.
Bashir, and we have to, Amos gets a, yeah, but Amos gets a last word if he wants one. It's a good place to end.
Yeah, so
sorry, no more.
Can I have a?
Yes, you can have a last word. Let me just tell you that you're all invited in just a moment to have a glass of wine with us downstairs, and you can continue discussing after that. But Amos is going to get the last word.
Yeah, I want to say, first of all, bring to your to the lady who asked about classrooms, and invite scholars, either Palestinians or other scholars or Arab scholars to your class. Read Arab or Palestinian text in your class. This is a way to bring their voices into and make them and listen to them. They have interesting things to say and to learn from them, and also legitimize them. Now I want to explain one thing that perhaps is not understood. The basic problem of a Jewish state is that you can be a German, and you can be a Muslim or Christian German, but you cannot be a Muslim Jewish. So there is no gate of assimilation. There is no, and it was ruled by the Supreme Court, which is, this liberal Supreme Court, that there is no Israeli nation. There is only a Jewish nation. And since 2018, it's also in the nation-state law that the state belongs only to the Jews. Now they expanded also from the river to the sea. So even if you are tolerated formally as a citizen inside 1967 borders, you are by definition discriminated, and there is no door to assimilation, to equality. There is just no door for that. So that's a huge problem of the Israeli left.
I'm sorry that we can't go on in a more formal way, especially for those who are still with us online and can't join us for a glass of wine. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thank you in particular to our three speakers tonight. Please join me.